I'm Joseph and we're from the King's Voice, which is the King's School Worcester student radio station.
Hello, both of you. I'm Peter Day. For 43 years or so, I worked mainly at the BBC, doing mainly programs for radio about business. And I'm retired now, and radio and podcasting is changing quite a lot at the moment. But I had a long journey in radio and a highly enjoyable one.
Fantastic. So, jumping into the first question, in 2019, only approximately 17.5% of BBC licensing fees were spent on radio. Now, there's potential cuts in licensing fees, so that number could shrink, with the effects being catastrophic, specifically in local radio. How do you feel about
that? We've been a sort of unfunded public good for an awful long time in radio. I used to get out a radio license. It was under £1, I think, for a year's listening, and everybody was supposed to have a radio license back in the 50s and 60s, and then they abolished that as too fiddly and television took over. And since then, of course, radio has been a kind of illegitimate child of the television license fee, but a rather important one. And now, faced with either a license fee that's not going up or one that's being cut, then the BBC has real funding problems, obviously. And radio and news, as well as television, will, I suppose, have to share the burden of reduced finance. And then always in the BBC, the bureaucracy turns to the fingertips of the organization, and that's local radio. And the BBC was a great pioneer of local broadcasting before commercial local broadcasting came along. BBC radio stations were all over the country and did quite a job in bringing an authentic new voice to the whole landscape of national broadcasting. And a BBC local radio station is a very different animal from a commercial one. It plays less music, and it is kind of more deeply rooted in the everydayness of the community, I think. And now that the local commercial stations are going much more together and are being run as a national groupings, then that authentic local voice that BBC local radio has been doing for 40, 50 years or so is in danger if they amalgamate them, if they cut down the amount of local programming, if the local information in particular. So it's an unhealthy state of affairs, but change is very much in the air, and the BBC is going to have to cut its coat to fit its cloth, or whatever the right phrase is about this. We're running out of money.
So would you say that a radio license would improve the chances of local radio surviving?
Oh, I think the days of a radio license have long gone. It's now just a proportion of the total amount raised by television. And the fight for the television license is going to be so acute over the next 5 or 10 or even less than that years, that to think in terms of any specific radio license is impossible. But radio is very much part of the total service offered by the BBC, and in a world of highly competitive television broadcasting, and people maybe not watching BBC television at all, but still having to pay the license fee, then the input that radio gives to the total amount of listening and viewing may be very, very important. And that local voice may be very important too in the total mix of what broadcasting is. So you ignore radio, BBC bosses, at your peril.
What has been the highlight of your career?
Well, 28 years of doing a program called In Business on Radio 4. I sort of tumbled into that, and I was something like 40, I suppose, and I'd been in news broadcasting, doing straight news and the Today program and things like that for a long time. And then suddenly they had an emergency on the this little weekly program in business, and they needed somebody to go out with a microphone. Here it is, and interview people, first of all in Britain, about what was going on in business, and then all over the world. And the really wonderful thing about that was I no longer had to do the share prices on the bottom of the screen anymore. So I moved out of the kind of conventional broadcasting of business as it had become, and moved into the feature side of it. And what the feature was, the great big story over those 28 years, was the way technology was bumping into the established way of working, of running companies, of running economies all over the world, because we added eventually a global business program which was very similar to it. So I had to travel to China, to India, to America a lot. And this compulsion to be in the field was the most wonderful, rewarding experience, talking to real people about real problems in real situations, without the compulsion to make pictures. It was a very easy thing. You go in, talk to somebody for half an hour, and then leave. And the exiting is also exciting because you are on to the next thing. And it was a most wonderful privilege to do this for 30 years. So it was a very long high spot. But the real high spots were not was the doing of it, the going on, the fact there was always a compulsion, always another. It's like planes landing at Heathrow or something. There's always another one coming down. So you were working on one program, you were working out what to do in 2 weeks, in 3 weeks, in 4 weeks' time. And that's enormously stimulating when there is so much change in the field you're covering, in the business field, which there was and still is. It was a very exciting time to be doing what I did.
Sounds fantastic. Now, I read that you won the Harold Wincott Award for Business Broadcast Journalism 3 times. Do you
I
consider
think more than 3 times, but I lost count after that, yes. It was a rather special award, and I won the first one, actually. They didn't do broadcasting when the Wincott Award started. Harold Wincott was I think he came from the city, but he started writing an avuncular sort of column for the Financial Times in the 50s, which indeed I used to read on a Saturday when the Financial Times dropped some of its very official sort of tone of voice and was looking now, of course, the Financial Times, like all the papers, has gone very featurey and very general on Saturdays. But in the old days, just 1 or 2 hints that this wasn't read by pinstripe people going to work in trains on a Saturday. And Harold Wincott was one of the people who brought talking about business and about economics to ordinary people. He talked to the readers as though they were sons and daughters, that kind of approach. So he was a very compelling writer of the 50s, and then the FT commemorated him with a prize that went to a lot of written journalists. And then I think in the 80s along came the Broadcast Award, and it was a very prestige sort of award with a lot of quite well-known judges from the City of London. And it was a great honor to win the first one for the Today program slots that I did, and then over time to win it several times afterwards. But it was one of those awards that you felt was really worth doing, and they gave it to you. You didn't have to apply on a piece of paper for it, which was really very, very, very honoring indeed. So it was a thing you put on your CV. Not that you get extra jobs from it, but the thing you mention when people ask you about it.
So would you say Harold Wincott was an inspiration to you?
To a certain extent, the prize was an inspiration. He was back when I was a boy. I was reading these columns, so he died a long time ago, and they've kept it going. So he wasn't an inspiration, but the fact there was a prize that was really rather special was an inspiration. Somebody is listening and bothering about the things we are trying to talk about every week on the radio. And that knowledge, until podcasting, there was no real knowledge of your audience. You didn't have much of a sense that people were actually listening. And then podcasting came along. And I remember going to Cambridge, say 15 years ago, and the BBC had started putting out our programs on the internet. And people came up at the conference I was talking to, quite famous sort of Cambridge people came up and said, talked about specific things in the program. So they weren't just saying nice program, tick. They were saying, liked the way you tackle so-and-so. And they were listening with their headphones on in the gym. And it was suddenly a realization that there was a new audience and you were able to connect with them one-to-one in a real way. And that was a dramatic change from broadcasting into the ether and not getting really very much response at all. That's a radical change between podcasting and the old style of broadcasting from a microphone to goodness knows who.
What advice would you give to someone considering a career in broadcast journalism?
Tread warily because it's changing so rapidly. The rise of podcasting in Britain, for example, is changing the landscape. The ownership of radio stations is changing the landscape, and whether the BBC will retain its preeminence in the jobs you aspire to, I don't know. But it is now an easy thing, as you know, in Worcester, the easy thing to start broadcasting, to start a podcast, to put it on the air, to try things out. You can make when I was joining the BBC, you had to, it was the only broadcaster, only radio broadcaster at the time, not much commercial competition. So you had to apply and nervously try out and maybe send a sample tape off. Now you can actually go and do it as, well, my children do it and my godchildren do it, and they're 3 or 4, they're learning to read. So we put out them reading Frog and Toad on a little internal podcast. And so you can try it out. And broadcasting, because it's the voice, it's not the pictures, is the most wonderfully intimate medium. And voices are such a telling way of communicating ideas if you get it right. But you can try all that out. You can see what fails, you can see what works, you can focus. And that's the thing. Applying for a job now, you can take an enormous portfolio of proof that you're aspiring to do the job or that you can do it. And that's the main thing, I think. You really have to want to do it. It's a highly competitive field, journalism and broadcasting. Broadcasting may well be a much larger field than it's been in the past because print may well dwindle away in many ways. So do it. That's the main advice I would give. Get and love it. It's a fascinating medium if you really like communicating one-to-one and finding out things. Be infinitely curious.
This follows on quite nicely. In the last 15 years, podcasts have gained a massive, almost cult following because of their range. Scrolling through the podcast app on my phone, I've seen new episodes featuring Barack Obama, stuff about gaming, food, cars, roundups of the news, and so much more. Obviously, in business was popular for many years. So why do you think podcasts have exploded in this way?
It's an American phenomenon to a very large extent, funded by money. Podcasting really came out of This American Life, the public radio series on American public radio every weekend with Ivor Glass. And out of that span the Serial, this very famous live sort of whodunit investigation. And that got huge audiences in America. Why in America? Because most radio broadcasting in America is music, and there's very little made programming in America. National Public Radio, particularly weekends, puts out a made program, edited and cut and with music overlay and all that highly produced stuff. But there isn't much else. Most news broadcasting is very basic news, and most American radio from coast to coast has been until very recently just music and local news. And so podcasting in America brought a technique which we've had in Britain because of the BBC for decades, made programming into public life in America for nearly the first time apart from NPR. And then people started waking up to the fact that you could charge for it or put ads around it, and it became an industry. And that industry is now spread over here, and the people think there's money in it. I doubt there's very much money in it in Britain, but the American broadcasters and podcasters are selling themselves for an awful lot of money. And there's a kind of frenzy in America with all sorts of internet related things like social networking and NFTs and all those things. And I think podcasting has got caught up in that sort of frenzy, a new sort of thing. And we've caught it here, and it's a very interesting potential thing because of this connectivity, as I spoke about earlier, with the individual audience. You know who's listening to you to a certain extent, and they can feed back if they don't like you. It's a much more immediate response than anything we ever had in broadcast radio. But I don't know how successful financially it's going to be in Britain, and that come back in 5 years and we'll see how podcasting has changed the broadcast scene. And it may not be quite as profound as it looks as though it might be at the moment.
That's about all we've got time for. So thank you very much for joining us, Pete, today, and for the interesting insight into broadcasting journalism.
Well, maybe I'm out of it now. I'm too old-fashioned, but thank you very much for the questions. And if you want to do it is the answer about this. And you can make a school podcast or a school radio show, as you know, and you can make a personal one if you can find the ideas. And it's a compelling thing to do. It's the most wonderful way of talking to people and having them listen to you.